Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the June session of our 2024-25 CIDER session series from the Canadian Initiative for Distance Education in partnership with the International Review of Research in Open and Distributed Learning and the Center for Distance Education, Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Athabasca University. For today's session, we're pleased to welcome back two of our most consistent supporters of CIDER, Drs. Michael Barbour and Randy LaBonte, for the latest installment of their ongoing mini-series of State of the Nation reports on Canadian K-12 online learning. Dr. Michael Barbour is Director of Faculty Development and Professor of Instructional Design for the College of Education and Health Sciences at Touro University, California. He has been involved with K-12 online and blended learning in a variety of countries for 2 decades as a researcher, teacher, course designer, and administrator. Dr. Randy LaBonte is the CEO of Can eLearn, a not-for-profit society promoting student success and providing leadership in online and blended learning, and a former adjunct professor at Vancouver Island University in online learning and teaching for K-12 educators, shifting practices to online learning environments. Together, they are researchers and advocates for policies designed to promote effective K-12 online and blended learning, with a particular interest in rural and remote learners, an interest that's now carried their State of the Nation series of reports into its 17th year. You'll find the reports at the State of the Nation website, k12sotn.ca. And I'm now passing the microphone to Michael and Randy. Everyone, welcome Drs. Michael Barbour and Randy LaBonte.
Hey folks, I'm glad to have you along. Actually, Dan, I was thinking about it as you were doing your introduction, and I'm going to have to go back and take a look because you've got me curious now to see how many sessions that Randy and I have done with CIDER over the years. And I know I've done a couple of ones outside of the State of the Nation ones on my own. So I'm going to have to go back and count those because it seems like a lot. Well, this is our 17th year doing this particular report. We've probably, I'm going to guess, about 60 to 65% of the time did those. So that would be 8 or 9 or 12 or so alone. So yeah, it'd be interesting to go back and look. So hey folks, as Dan mentioned, I'm Mike Barbour at Touro University. My colleague Randy LaBonte up in beautiful British Columbia right now. And we're basically going to go through a bit of a formal presentation for the first roughly half, and then spend the second half really focused upon the types of questions you guys might have that brought you here today. And I've got a lot more slides than what I intend to use, just in case you guys have questions about something, then I can bring them up. So when you do see the slides, when Dan sends out the recording, if there are slides that you see that you didn't see during the session, that's because we had other things ready in case folks had specific questions along the way. So with that, I will get ready to share my screen. Let's see. I want to share my screen. There we go. So can I get a thumbs up, Randy, if you can see that? Perfect.
You betcha.
All right. So first of all, I want to thank the sponsors that have been involved with Can eLearn and this particular project over the years. So if you're not familiar, the State of the Nation is a separate independent project that I've been running, and that Randy's joined me for, I guess, the last 8 or 9, 10-ish years. I'll know when I see the covers for sure how many. That is sponsored by a variety of programs and organizations and companies across Canada. Can eLearn is a project partner with that. And then Open School BC have been our publishers for a little bit over half of the time that we've actually been publishing this now. And they do that pro bono, which is a wonderful thing. And we thank all of them for it, because without this list of folks, we probably would have given up the project many years ago. And I say many years ago because I love updating this slide every year, because I just get to add another cover to it, and you can sort of see how the project has changed changed from being originally something that the North American Council, or NACL, sponsored, which became INACL, or the International Association for K-12 Online Learning. I know there's no C in International Association for K-12 Online Learning, but that's neither here nor there, to being something that Open School BC and Can eLearn have been primarily involved with. And you can sort of see how the covers have evolved over the years. I think we're running out of colors. As you can see, we're reusing a lot of blues there. A lot of reds for that matter that I'm thinking about. Maybe we'll have to use something yellow or nice and bold next year with that. So as Dan mentioned, and I think Randy's dropped the chat or the link into the chat, each of the annual reports, as well as the provincial breakdowns, are available on our website. And the website actually contains a lot more information than what the printed reports do. Starting about 7 years ago, we stopped reproducing the exact profile for each of the jurisdictions, because in some cases there weren't many changes from year to year in terms of what we were seeing. So what the PDF or the printed report does is it basically updates you on terms of telling you what's changed since the last report. So you need to go to the website and click on the data and information link there, and then go to whichever jurisdiction you happen to be interested in to see exactly what the profile for that particular report, that particular jurisdiction is for that year. So for those of you who are familiar with the report, this is going to be old hat to you, but basically the way this works is around this time of the year. Actually, Randy and I were planning on doing it about 2 weeks ago, and then it just sort of fell by the wayside. So we're hoping to do it later today. We'll send out a survey to each of the ministries of education. We'll start looking through anything we can find online, from popular media to documents that might be on the ministry's website, to even reports that are coming from the individual programs that are offering distance learning across the country. And from all of those sources as well, we'll usually with most of the ministries, and in some cases some of the third-party folks, will usually do some follow-up questioning with them to find out, because while the ministries are a great source of information, in all honesty, I would say our primary source of information, what the ministry says is happening and what actually is happening on the ground oftentimes is slightly different. So that's one of the reasons why we try to involve a lot of those project partners and key stakeholders across the nation with this. The other thing that we do, although the response rate to it has dropped off significantly, is we actually invite all of the online programs across the country to complete a survey, and we publish their results as part of the provincial profile. So you'll see, if you go and look at a province or territorial profile, there's a table about 2/3 of the way down that has the most recent response that we've received from any of the programs. So for those of you who happen to be from one of the distance or online programs across the country, when you go to your particular province or territory and you scroll down there, if the date on that particular survey doesn't say 23-24, that means we didn't get your response last year. And the link for it is right on the main page of the website, so you can feel free to complete that survey at any time, because we can update those in real time as they come in. So a little plug for that. And now that we're getting to the end of another school year, if you want to update your 24-25 data, that would be wonderful as well. So as I said, the ministries are our main source of data, and you can see that over the years, we've had some years that are better than others. So the ones that are shaded are ones we're either getting information that's dated or we're not getting information. And the one I'll point out, particularly the dated one, is Ontario. Ontario, because of the size of a couple of the school districts, their ability to get the data and then be able to make it official or to essentially double check it, takes a bit of time. So in most cases, the data, well, in most cases, in every case, the data that we get from Ontario is usually a year or two behind. So I don't want to mislead folks, because most of these, in all honesty, that are shaded are ones that just don't respond. But Ontario is the sort of the outlier in there, because they respond every year. They're very good participants in terms of supporting the project. It's just that in their case, the the information is dated. I suspect what I probably should do is create two different types of shading here so that I can differentiate them in that way. One of the things you'll notice is that in recent years, particularly the last two, the number of jurisdictions that we're not hearing from have increased a fair amount. What we've found, or what we've been told anecdotally, is that it's not that they don't have the information. It's not that they can't produce the information. In many cases, they're not given permission to release the information. I'll use Alberta as a good example, because based on the actual data here, it looks like that they didn't respond. They did respond. They just responded after the print deadline. So we asked them in June. From what I understand from the folks in the ministry, it only took a day or so for them to pull the information and have it ready to go. They finally got permission in, I think it was late February, early March, to release that information to us. So the information actually that you find on the website is dated, or is up to date, sorry, even if the information that we produced in the report, because it was finalized at the end of December, doesn't include that information. So when we're looking at regulation across the country, typically what we've seen is in most cases, most jurisdictions in their Education Act or Schools Act have some reference to distance learning. In most of those examples, it basically just says the minister has the authority to regulate distance learning, and that's pretty much all it says. The two main exceptions to that, two main exceptions. In the case of Nova Scotia, because the distance learning is largely regulated through the collective agreement that the government has with the Nova Scotia Teachers Association, or Nova Scotia Teachers Union. That the collective agreement is a piece of legislation that has to get passed by the House. So that's included in there. The other exception that we see here is British Columbia. And British Columbia has significant language around digital learning in both the Schools Act and the Independent Schools Act that regulate the how it works there. You'll also see policy handbooks, agreements, and MOUs in some cases are used by some jurisdictions, although the MOUs are primarily for the territories. And in those cases, it's usually an MOU with a online program in a southern province that they're partnering with. So in terms of what this looks like, you'll notice that this map is a little bit different this year than what it has been in previous years. We've changed the language. We used to basically say, what was it, district programs, federal or provincial programs, or a combination of the two. What we've started describing it as is centrally supported programs, centrally managed programs, or district managed programs. And the reason for that really was because what we were seeing in places like Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, they have centralized support for things, but both in terms of content and in terms of services such as the LMS and that kind of thing. But all of the programs were managed at the school board level. Whereas in other provinces, when it's managed at the school board or school division or school district level, typically the province doesn't have that much involvement. Sort of one kind of exception to that, and this is where we've been toying with this map for years now and really trying to refine it. British Columbia is a bit of an outlier in that, because in British Columbia, while you have all of the programs are district managed, some of them have permission to operate at a provincial level. Others have permission to operate only at a district level. So that's where you get your POLs, or provincial online schools, and DOLs, or district online schools. So it's and if you are a POL, you have to use the provincial LMS, whereas if you're a DOL, you don't have to. I think if you wanted to, you could, but you have to pay to be able to do so, if I remember correct, Brandy.
Yes, yeah, it is. They have choice over that as well, but they also don't need to follow policy. So their students are treated as just part of the school district, but they're bound within that geographic area. So some of the district online programs closed because they didn't have enough funding or allocation or students to be involved, because before they could enroll students from outside of their geographic boundary. which is where they manage to build the program. So it has changed the landscape to a certain extent as well for that. Now, Connie asked a question, Michael, with regards to Saskatchewan in terms of the transition. So they did SunWest program became designated as a Crown Corporation Sask DLC, or Saskatchewan District Learning Center, and they outreached and picked up some of the teachers who were doing work in their own individual programs in a lot of the other locations for that. So what's the effect on, because it's still allowed to have your own programs run in Saskatchewan, but I think, Michael, you had some information about the number of programs that were in operation after the Sask DLC was launched.
Yeah, as of right now, I mean, keep in mind that the latest report, even though we're talking about it now near the end of the 24-25 school year, the latest report was finalized in December of 24. So it reported on the 23-24 school year. So we're a year basically removed. So the Crown Corp that was created had only had a year of operation at that point in time. And when you look at the number of programs, there were still 15 different programs operated by 8 school divisions in Saskatchewan. They also had 2 independent schools and 4 First Nations online programs that were operating. So there were a total of 21 programs in addition to the province-wide one that were still in operation. Now, my guess is that the number of school divisions and the number of online schools that they operate have probably decreased slightly this year. Although from what I'm hearing, it's not significant. I think it's gone down from 8 divisions to 6 divisions and 15 schools down to 10 or 11, if I remember what I've heard from there. So they're still having a lot of activity there with that. And you'll notice that's the only one that we've got striped because of that reason. The Crown Corp would basically be the red lines there, and all of those other programs that I just mentioned would be the blue lines. And trying to figure out what to do with BC without creating another color was sort of the issue that we've got there, because they do have, so if you're a poll, you do receive some centrally supported services, but so we could have done blue and green if we wanted to there, but that wouldn't apply to the doles, so that was our challenge there. One of the other things that we did include this year, which we haven't included in previous years, was that there are 4 jurisdictions where we see a fair amount of private or independent online or distance learning activity, mainly, as you can see, in Western Canada in terms of the number of provinces. Although when you're looking at the level of activity, Ontario basically is the lion's share of that particular activity, something that's been increasing in recent years. But even if we were having this conversation 5-6 years ago, they would still have the majority in terms of the numbers there. One of the things we've been toying with, and I know I saw John Watson drop in here, so he'll be happy to see these, because these are things that he's included in his, they used to be the Keeping Pace report. It's now the Snapshot report. We're trying to figure out a new model for essentially something to replace this more basic model. So some of the things that we've been looking at are ones that John and his team at Evergreen, as part of the DLAC community, have been toying with over the years. So for folks who are in the room, if you're not familiar with these, we'd love to tell you a little bit more about these types of things. Feel free to email with us, because we're wondering if this kind of information would be useful, and whether or not is something we should incorporate into our provincial tellings. So to get down to the activity, as you can see here, for the most part, the activity is, I won't say is staying roughly consistent. We're actually growing a little bit, but it's growing in certain places and leveling off in others. So Atlantic Canada, it's been pretty close to the same for most of the last really 10 years, with maybe the exception of New Brunswick has increased a little bit during that time, and really post-pandemic for the most part. Quebec has always been in that 4 to 5% range. We're starting to see some growth in Ontario. Manitoba has actually been about there. Oddly enough, the Saskatchewan numbers have actually been going down in recent years. They were up over 10% a couple of years ago, and we're seeing a decrease there. The number that is in the published version of Alberta is about 10%. We've learned from the data that we got back in February, March, that number is actually closer to 35%. And has been since the closure of the ADLC, which also is roughly around the same time we saw some changes in how funding was done in Alberta. So we've seen actually in the past 3 years, apparently, even though we haven't been able to report it because we haven't had data from Alberta for the annual report, what we've learned is that the last 3 years have seen a significant decline in the level of participation in Alberta, so that they're down in the 4 to 5% range now or less. BC has actually been in that 10 point something area for pretty much the last decade. I think there was 1 year they actually got 11.2 and then 1 year where they were 9.8. But if you go through the history of our reports, they're always pretty close to 10 point something. And the Yukon are actually increasing significantly as well. To give you some sort of sense. And from a national perspective, I mean, as you can see, the Canadian Teachers Federation back in 2000 did an estimate for the 99-2000 school year, and they estimated about 0.5% of students. And then the rest of those figures are since we've been tracking them as a part of our State of the Nation. And you can see that for the most part, we've seen a fairly, I won't say it's not a steep incline by any amount, but we've got a fairly steady level that's going there, with the exception of the two pandemic school years, so the 2021 and 21-22. And as you'll see in a few minutes, that sort of skews it a little bit. But if you remove those two, you actually come up with a really nice line there. Looking at some of the trends that we've seen over the years, 4 that we identified in this year's report. One is that the availability of data and our ability to get data is decreasing, it seems, every single year. So as you can see, the number of shaded blocks there where we're getting no data, at least from official sources, or we're only being able to get dated data is increasing significantly. I'll point to my home province of Newfoundland. The last time we heard from the ministry or the provincial program there was in 2021. So for the 2020-21 school year. And starting in 22 was when the ministry on their website stopped publishing the distance education enrollments as part of their key statistics that they were doing. Whereas before that, you could go in and actually go on a course by course basis and see how many students, and they would even break it down by gender, took each and every single course at a distance in the province. And, so we're having difficulty more so than we have in the past being able to say that what we're reporting is complete and accurate, because we're getting less and less participation from folks. And as you can see from the individual program survey, that bears out quite a lot. Although I'll be perfectly honest with you and say that the biggest drop that we've seen, so we've always been in the low 20s or high teens. And if we were to continue this back into the 20 teens, it would always be in that low 20s. What happens between 22 and 23 is there are 300 new private programs or independent programs added in Ontario. And then from 23 to 24, there's another couple of hundred that get in there. So you see with just the sheer number of Ontario programs joining, you can see that the participation rate drops significantly, which then impacts the overall rate. Because up until this point in time, when we were hitting the low 20s and teens, we were in the roughly 400 to 500 programs across the country. Whereas once we hit up here, we're getting into the 700-800 range, and now we're up into the 800-900 range over here. So most of those new programs have never communicated with us at all. So that's one of the things that's skewing that data, but it does impact the ability to get that information. And in jurisdictions that haven't, I'll point at BC. while Randy mentioned there's been a lot of changes, and we've seen some of the district programs decide that they were going to close. Many of them became polls. Most of the districts that are operating today were operating a program 5 years ago, but yet 5 years ago, a quarter of them would respond to our survey. The last 2 years, it's been just over 5%. So for those of you who are from BC, or for that matter, any jurisdiction that you see here, because none of them are responding at that high a rate, with the exception of Alberta, to be honest with you. And even then, it's still less than 1 out of every 5.
I think because part of the reason is they provide all that data to the ministry. They just assume that that level of data gets reported.
I'm going to say that you're being generous and accurate, and I'll leave it at that, because I don't necessarily say I would necessarily agree with that, but that's just me.
I live in BC and work with many of the people in those programs, so I'm saying it on their behalf.
Well, let's be generous and go with that. Where am I to here? I don't know why that slide is there. It's a duplicate slide. Oh, I went back one. That's why. So as I mentioned, we've seen some growth in different areas. The one I'll point out here, as I mentioned before, with Saskatchewan, you can see went from 7.6 to 12% and 10% during the pandemic, and they've dropped significantly. You can see BC, with the exception of the pandemic year, has always been in that 10 point something range for the most part. What we've learned is Alberta now, after this 21-22 school year, actually drops down to around 4 to 5% during these 2 years. So that's actually not accurate. But for the most part, you can see a lot of jurisdictions not changing all that much. Ontario is slowly growing. We can say that that number is going to be much higher, because the first class of folks who would have had to complete the online learning requirements. So for those who are unfamiliar, Ontario requires students to have 2 e-learning courses in order to graduate from high school. So at some point during their 4 years of high school, have to take 2 online courses, although you can get written out of that requirement. But the data here is 2 years old.
Yeah, written out of that requirement. A lot of folks, the mandatory e-learning was not mandatory, in the sense that all the parents had to do was to simply send a note on to the school, and they could be opted out.
Or from what I've learned, at least from one school, that all of the homeroom teachers handed out a form that the parents had to fill in child's name and their signature at the bottom, and have them bring back before the end of the semester. And I don't know how many schools were doing that, but I did learn of at least one school that did, because a good friend of mine, his daughter was at a school that did that for them. So in some cases, it's not just parental folks that are pulling out, but it's being actively encouraged by the schools themselves. But the other thing is that this data is actually 2 years old as well. So if you're looking at it, you're seeing, again, if you get rid of the pandemic years, you're seeing a jump of about 0.5 to 0.75% each year. So we can anticipate that that number, if we were to have the most up-to-date figure for that, probably is in the 9% range now, to be honest. But we've seen a lot of impact from we saw a lot of individual impact during the pandemic, and there's the pandemic series from Can eLearn. But when we look at the overall, and this was that line of best fit that I was talking about, if with the exception of back here when we were still only getting responses from about half of the ministries, so we were extrapolating data from the rest of them. If you sort of look at, once we start getting good data, which would be around the 2015, 2016 year, you can see that there's a pretty steady line here. And with the exception of those 2 pandemic years, you see that line tends to get followed pretty well. And I suspect we'll see that, if once we get 24, 25, it'll end up being roughly about right there, I'm going to guess, because that line has been fairly consistent as we've done this. So that's sort of, I'll put in a plug for the website again, and that's really sort of where I'm going to end the formal part of the presentation. this is my contact information, and Randy, you can drop yours in the chat because I know you've been monitoring that. We wanted to leave roughly half of our time here to be able to have some conversation with folks about things that they're specifically interested in. You all came here hoping to find out information about something. Hopefully the overview gave you some of that, or at least where to look on our website or in the report to get some of that. But my guess is you probably have additional questions, and we wanted to make sure we had lots of time to be able to handle those. So I'm going to stop sharing here now and open it up for folks that might have questions. And I don't know if I missed any as they came through the chat or not, Randy. I know you did point out one that you said was there.
We're good. It's open for comments, questions, suggestions.
And feel free to drop it in the chat or grab the mic and ask away.
All right, so anyone who would like to post a question or to just grab the microphone, you're welcome to do so. And while we're just waiting for that, I'll put out a reminder that the recording of today's session will be posted later today at cideresearch.ca. And we have a question here from Connie. Go ahead, Connie.
Yeah, thanks, Michael and Randy. Always interesting to see those results that are coming in. You had the question about whether the reports would benefit from a further breakdown, and you were showing, I think, something coming from Michigan or DLAC, something like that. Personally, I would like that breakdown because to me, it shows maturity in our understanding of what is online teaching and learning and what that's looking like for both teachers and for the learners. So I think personally, if you have the time and the energy, I know it's always a lot of effort to continually revise or, look at your processes, but I think that would be helpful information. And I'm just wondering, like you were saying, there's this huge rise in private. So is there a master list of these private online schools, like you mentioned in Ontario? And, if you could give some further comment about that rise.
Yeah, so there is a master list. I know Randy has dug it up a couple of times because it's actually posted right on the ministry's website. I know I've got the link somewhere, and I see Randy's on his computer.
I got it.
He looks like he's typing away, so I'm figuring he's going to. There we go. I suspect there's a couple of things that are happening there. One is that it coincides with both the dramatic increase we saw during the pandemic, because most of these programs began at roughly that time, and it also, the online learning requirement that they have, the graduation requirement in Ontario, came about at about the same point in time. It was first announced in 2019, debated throughout 2020, and then came into effect with last year's graduating seniors were the first ones that were kept to it. The other thing that you have with Ontario, and this is actually unique within the Canadian context, is that if a school does have a ministry identification code, so if they are considered a school, they have the ability to transcript credits regardless of where the student is located. So what we've seen is a lot of these private online programs, many of them are either attached to or affiliated with an existing private school, and they're using it as a way to generate revenue by enrolling students that, well, they aren't Canadians. They're enrolling students from around the world, but able to give them Ontario high school credit. And if they did the entire program with them, they could actually give them an Ontario secondary school diploma, having never stepped foot into Canada. And there's a couple of programs that have been around for decades that have been doing this and doing this quite successfully, which is one of the reasons why the largest private programs are located in Ontario. But there are also a lot of ones that I think have started in recent years, and we have no idea how many students those are catering to, that are trying to essentially get this international market, because everywhere else the only way you can educate a student outside of your jurisdiction, even for the private programs, is if that student has some connection to the province. So I'll use your neck of the woods as an example. If you have some family that, you know, is in, you know, that's working in the oil patch, and all of a sudden they're dispatched for 2 years to Qatar, they can still do an online program from Alberta because they have that connection. And the intention is at the end of 2 years, they're going to come back to Alberta. Whereas they can't just randomly enroll a Qatar national into an online program in Alberta. It's against their guidelines. So I think there's two things happening there, and I think it's probably a combination of both of those.
Okay, one more question. Do you anticipate any changes or shifts in some of this with the rise of Gen AI? What do you see on the horizon?
Well, first of all, Randy and I have very different opinions on this. Randy is much more optimistic about this than I am. I often point back to if you there was an article in Atlantic Monthly that Todd Oppenheimer wrote in the early 2000s, or it might have been the late 19, I think it was early 2000s, called The Computer Delusion. It corresponded with a book that he did. And there's a paragraph in there that talks about like how, you know, the motion picture was going to revolutionize education. And then radio was going to revolutionize education. And then the teaching machine was going to revolutionize for education. And he was writing this right about the time that Clinton and Gingrich were doing their big internet initiative in the US. And, you know, the internet was going to revolutionize education. And, you know, take your pick. I mean, we've got, you know, folks like Michael Horn and his cohort that, you know, 12 years ago, 15 years, I guess 15 years ago now, said that half of all education in well, he said the U.S. was going to be done online by the end of in the next decade. And I mean, I guess he was right. It only took a global pandemic for it to happen. But, you know, prior to that, it was, and John is in the room, so he can maybe help me with the numbers. But I'm going to guess that as of the 2019-2020 school year, prior to the pandemic, we might have seen 5 to 8% of U.S. kids that were taking one or more courses online. You know, so Michael was only off by 45%. You know, so is Gen AI going to revolutionize education? Possibly. I mean, you know, I think we've seen this before, and I'm not necessarily that big a supporter of the fact that it's going to do much more than any of those other tools have done. You know, it's going to pick away at the edges. You're going to have early adopters that are going to do some really creative and interesting things with it. You're going to have some individual programs that are probably going to be incredibly innovative around their use of it. But in terms of a system-wide change in how we educate, I don't see it happening personally.
I'm going to say it depends on how you define education. If it's education, as we know, in terms of a holistic piece, in terms of looking at things, and yes, John, I'll let you comment. But I think that AI has an impact in how we manage and organize, and how teachers may be able to be helped in terms of how they develop and work in the online environment. John, go ahead.
Thank you, Randy, and thanks, Michael. Sorry, I'm not on video. I'm traveling, so I'm on my phone. Michael, I just wanted to weigh in because you asked for my comment on the numbers that you gave, 5 to 8%. Yeah, roughly. I mean, the full-time online numbers in the U.S. Pre-pandemic in any state never upped 2%. Post-pandemic, they've gone a little bit higher when you add in the single courses and also the hybrids. That's actually an interesting thing that maybe we can return to at some point in this discussion. It's still probably in that 5 to 8% at most, like you're talking about. So totally agree with you that the prediction in Disrupting Class was off by a bit.
interesting. John mentions hybrid schools, and as John alluded to, they are increasing significantly in the U.S. environment. It's not something we've seen a lot of in the Canadian context. There are some interesting, and again, this is a good example of this kind of innovation, Connie. There's some really interesting examples of folks that have created some isolated hybrid programs that I think are worth looking at, and I would love to see replicated. But you know, they are quite isolated, and in terms of the number of them, there's nowhere near the proliferation of them in Canada as compared to, say, what we see in the US. Or Australia, for that matter. Australia is doing a lot of blended and hybrid type stuff as well, you know, school-wide, program-wide, that we're not seeing in quite as much in Canada.
Sure, if I could ask you a little bit further about that, essentially asking about similar data, but through a different lens. One of the things that we're seeing a lot of in the US is there's a lot of different types of programs that we consider hybrid for our data purposes. They don't tend to think of themselves that way. And I'll give you a few examples. One is dual credit. Quite a bit of dual credit, quite a number of dual credit programs. They don't tend to be huge numbers, but there's some that are high schools that are located on community college campuses. So that's one example. In California, independent study has hundreds of thousands of students. Those are what we would consider hybrid. There's a mix of sort of a crossover between independent study and homeschool, which I know is a different, it's a different thing in the US compared to Canada. Quite a bit of CTE that I would put in this category. And then the last one is an emerging number of these programs that are specifically designed to recapture students who have dropped out of high school to get them back in, and it's often being run independently of the district, even if it's still in name a district program, but it's run separately. I'm curious how much of that you're seeing in Canada, and to the extent that you're seeing quite a bit of it, what if you're able to track it and what the data challenges look like.
Yeah, so I'll get Randy to jump in a second, because actually one of the more, I think, better programs and more innovative hybrid programs are actually located closer to Randy than what is closer to me, obviously. So I'll start with the one you mentioned last, you know, that idea of recapturing high school students. Typically, we don't see school divisions or really any programs that are set up specifically for that population of students, with the exception of maybe a couple of highly dense urban areas. So there's, you know, might be a couple of programs in Vancouver. I'm aware of a couple that exist in Toronto, one that exists in Ottawa. In most cases, those students, if they are coming back at all, are coming back through actually the old correspondence schools that existed in those provinces. So in Ontario, it's actually it's called the Independent Learning Center now, or ILC. In Quebec, it's SOFED. And you're going to test my French to remember exactly what the whole thing is, but it's Society for something for the Formation de, I can't remember the O, and obviously the D is Distance. And if Robert is in the audience, I apologize for that, because I should know it, because Robert was always one of the folks who would respond every single year to our program survey. So those ones are specifically set up to recapture folks that have dropped out of school at the age of 16 or older. And I think they can stay in those programs until they're 22 or 21, depending on the jurisdiction. A lot of that dual credit CTE type thing, we don't see that as much in Canada as what you see in the US in terms of participation levels. And in most of the cases when we do see it, it tends to be in our urban areas. We don't really see it at all in our rural areas. And as you might imagine, you know, Canada's largely rural in nature in terms of when we're looking at our overall population. Where we see the hybrid programs most often, and they will describe themselves in many cases as hybrid programs, are often ones that were a distance program or were associated with a distance program that specifically made a conscious effort to create another program or to change the way in which they were offering their online program to include that somewhat of a face-to-face component within that model. Navigate NIDES is probably the one that I think of when I think of that most, which is in British Columbia. And I know, Randy, you're much more familiar with that program than I am.
Yeah, I think some of the programs in BC have gone to, although they're listed as online, there's a lot of hybrid activity per se. And one of the other ones, John, that you may be familiar with as well is HCOS, or Heritage Christian, but they have a school that now they've converted their local school in Kelowna to call it a Flex Academy. So they've really picked up on that initiative around personalized learning and using multiple means of engaging them in learning, supported online, face-to-face, project-based, and a whole number of other strategies around that. And we've seen a little bit more flexibility in some of the private schools as well, certainly in Ontario, about how they manage to offer services for students, whereas the public are a little bit more structured and a little more confined in traditional bureaucracies.
The other issue that they're finding that the funding issue is a big one for a lot of the Canadian programs in this respect, because most jurisdictions, either they fund schools or they fund face-to-face schools and then online schools or distance schools separately. So if you're in a jurisdiction where you've got to make a decision, you've got to make a decision to either describe yourself as a distance school or describe yourself as a brick and mortar school. And oftentimes the distance schools get a little bit less funding than what the brick and mortar schools do, particularly if it's an independent one, because oddly enough, and this is something actually unique for Canada, John, that we don't see in the US. In most jurisdictions in Canada, independent schools still get some government funding, not all, but in most. Usually it's only a small amount. If I remember correctly, in BC, it's roughly 40% or so. 50%. Yeah. So that's something that we don't see in the US at all. There's no public funding for private schools in the US, at least at the state level. Whereas in Canada, that is a common thing. Yeah, and Connie's saying in Alberta, it's closer to 90%. And I think Ontario is the only one that doesn't provide any at all. And I think Saskatchewan is down around 40 or 30%, if I remember correctly, as is Manitoba. So, but that's, I think, one of the other caveats that you've got with these hybrid programs is even if they, like NIDES, I remember talking with the principal once, and they describe themselves as a face-to-face program, because that way they get slightly more funding than they would if they were a distance program. And there's no, in the legislation, there's nothing that says what proportion you have to have face-to-face. So in his mind, the principal's mind at the time, I don't know if it's still the same principle, as long as 51% of what they did was face-to-face, he wasn't breaking the provincial law around that. So because the majority of what they did was face-to-face, and that was fine. But yeah, we don't see it at the same levels, John. And I think probably the urban role thing is the biggest thing for us. And then, yeah, that's probably, I would say, the biggest issue.
Thank you, Michael. One quick follow-up, if that's okay. You referred to some correspondence schools or courses. Are they literally still sending out paper? Because we see some of those that were correspondence and now they're digital, they're online. They may not be in the way that some other online schools are, but we do consider them hybrid. And I wonder what you're seeing around those specifically.
For the most part, they have shifted to some sort of online format. So they're not sending out paper through Canada Post anymore. Although the one in Quebec actually still can. So all of the material that they have online, they still have the ability to send out the paper. And I can't say from last year, but 2 years ago when we did the report, I remember talking with one of the teachers, and they still had he still had two of his students that he would go and print the PDFs for and send it out because they didn't have reliable internet at home to be able to do this. But most of them, like you've seen in the US, while they were old correspondence schools, the one in Nebraska is the one I think of oftentimes, because they're still in the Nebraska Online School is still actually in the exact same office that the old correspondence unit of the Department of Education was in. They still have all the file folders over there, at least they did 5 years ago, or 2019 when last time I saw it. All the old file folders over there with literally 6-7 decades worth of correspondence materials that they could use. They've moved to an online model, and ILC is probably a good example of that, to the point that when they were actually debating the graduation requirement back in 2019-2020, one of the proposals was that ILC could lease their content to programs internationally who wanted the ability to use a high quality online course without having to develop their own. I don't think they were ever able to accomplish that, but that was one of the conversations. So that gives you a sense as to what they felt about the quality of their asynchronous course content that they had at the time.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks, Michael, for that answer, and thanks for this discussion today. I appreciate it.
Not a problem. We've got about 7 or 8 minutes left if other folks have questions. I see a couple of folks in the chat have added some specific percentages, and Leanna, I thank you for that, updating the Alberta one for us. So you're all across my screen here, so I'm just...
Not hearing any other questions?
No, I see there's a comment Connie just put in there in the chat, and it's an @Randy, so I don't know if you want to jump on that.
Yeah, in terms of funding, I don't want to get involved in discussions around how funds are allocated by different ministries of education, so that we can keep positive relationships with all of them.
All right, so yes, I do have one final question if no one else has anything. Just really about the future of your report project itself. I know you said you had year 18 has begun, and I'm wondering how you see this going forward over the years. I mean, a project like this for 17 years is unusual and important. So yeah.
That's a question Randy and I have roughly around this time of year every year when we decide whether or not we're going to actually, because as you saw from the top, the way in which we're able to do this is because we get sponsors from all of these online programs and from these companies, but that does require Randy and I going out and chasing all of these folks to see, I think we had about 12 or 10 folks listed across the first slide that I put up, and we probably contact the 60 to 80 folks every year. We've had some folks that have consistently sponsored this, Learn in Quebec, the Ontario Virtual School, Virtual High School Ontario is actually probably our longest standing one. Yeah. We've had others that have come in and out. Heritage Christian Online was one of the earlier sponsors, and we lost for a number of years, and they're back in. And then we have other folks that just come in for a year or two and then drop off again. I'm not sure what we've committed to year 18. Next April we might, and it's kind of funny because usually it's around November, December when Randy and I start having conversations. But okay, this is it. We're finished this year, because we're trying to get folks to respond and getting frustrated because we're not hearing from this ministry or that ministry or this key stakeholder or that. And then by the time it comes out, we start having these conversations with, because we do briefings for the ministry with just the ministry folks. We do a special session with all of the sponsors. We usually do a couple of public events like this. And then we start to think, well, maybe one more year wouldn't be so bad. And then we start going through and trying to get sponsors. And you're thinking, well, geez, we might not even get enough for this coming year, even though we want to do it. So I honestly can't. That's a long-winded way of saying I don't know. In my ideal world, I'd like to at least get 20, because if you're going to end at some point, it's always nice to end on a round number. But I mean, the nice thing about it is that the partners that we do have in most of the ministries tend to be quite interested and quite supportive of it. Oftentimes, their lack of response is either due to turnover, so not, the file not being handed off from someone who's been a great partner to someone who's coming in, or in many cases, the folks above them that need to be able to sign off on the release of data. So one of the things we often hear from them is they value this information a great deal, because the CMEC doesn't collect data around this. I believe they are sniffing around about potentially doing something in this area, because I've had a couple of folks that have reached out to me to ask about if Statistics Canada or CMNC has contacted me, because apparently they were contacted about doing something along those lines. So if someone else were to pick this up, I would be more than happy to hand it off to them and to maybe partner with them for the first couple of years till we get to a round number, and then exit stage right.
Yeah, and for those that the CMEC is the Canadian Council for Ministries of Education, so the provincial folks that meet, and also there was an organization where the those that were in the civil service would meet annually to share ideas when all of the online pieces were developing. So there was a lot of Kool-Aid drinkers as well. We formed CANeLearn. We started meetings in 2010, I guess, in 2012, and launched CANeLearn as an official nonprofit in 2013. And then as we've gone on, Dan, there's been waning, interest, et cetera, or those others who were part of that whole group have moved on to other things or retired. So it's hard to keep the initiative momentum going, which is what you alluded to, I think, with your question.
Yes. Well, it's whether it's 17 years, 18 years, 20 or 30 years, I mean, to have that kind of archive of data, that someone out there is keeping track of these things and seeing how things change over time is very valuable.
And I do have to say that's because Michael Barbour is relentless and never gives up. So he is the one that he'll grab you but carry it forward. This would not happen and would have died a long time ago if it weren't for his tenacity. So thank you, Michael, for keeping that going and dragging myself into it and others.
Well, I'll also add my competitiveness, and John has heard this speech before, but John beat me to this particular type of initiative because he started doing one in the US, I think 3 years before I released the first Canadian one. And because, I'm fiercely nationalistic and, quite competitive by nature, I thought there's no way the US should be doing this when we were here first, and I think we do it better. So in all honesty, if John had never done the Keeping Pace ones, I probably never would have done the State of the Nation ones to begin with. So I have to tip my hat to John for that, because without him, I wouldn't have started.
And on that note, I think we can bring this to a close. So thank you again, Randy and Michael, for your work on the report and for joining us in CIDER today. Just a reminder that, again, the recording will be posted later today at CIDEresearch.ca. And that brings our season to a close as well, the 2024-25 season. So if anyone has any research that they would like to share with us and with our audience, we are taking suggestions for our 25-26 season starting in September. So send me a note at dwilton@askbaskeyu.ca, and I will be happy to talk to you about any presentation suggestions that you might have. Right, and I would like also to thank our audience for joining us today. So with that, I will bring this session to a close and turn off the recording.